Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this afternoon's lecture by Amade M'charek. We would like to welcome on this occasion not only our speaker, who is a fellow of the IWM currently, but also her discussant especially, and that is, I mean, we welcome always all our discussants, but there is a special warm welcome for Mieke Verloo, who has not only been associated with the Institute for many, many years as a non-resident permanent fellow, who has had some very important projects on gender housed at the Institute, but in this particular case, we owe her a real debt of gratitude for bringing Amade to us, and I will say more in a moment something about that. Amade M'charek is Professor of Anthropology of Science at the Department of Anthropology of the University of Amsterdam since 2008. Her research interests are very, very broad and very unusual. They are in the field of forensic anthropology, of forensics and race, with a particular focus on the social aspects of various biomedical technologies and practices, such as human genetic diversity, diversity in medical practice, and forensic genetics. This is a very unusual career because she worked as a population geneticist at the forensic lab in Leiden, so she's really had a couple of years of lab experience in turning these laboratories and forensics into an object of ethnographic inquiry, but also using the techniques to further the study of anthropological questions. So for this very, very unusual profile and for a very prolific academic output, with a subject which I will come to in a moment, Amade was given in 2014 the highly prestigious ERC, the European Research Council Consolidator Grant, which enables her to do the research which we are going to hear something on today. Her research is on a project which is called Race Face ID. It's on face making and race making. We will learn something about both these aspects in forensic identification. The aim of the project is to develop both theoretical concepts and frameworks, but also methods with which to understand the simultaneous presence, but also the absence of race in science and in society. So what she does is something which is, I think, very different from what is usually done in our discipline, I should say, my discipline also, anthropology, which is to say race is a social construction. So it just takes a social constructivist approach, which is part of the story, but not the whole story, as we are going to learn. So what she does is she takes biological factors into account and thus goes beyond the social constructivist paradigm to unravel in a way how race is shaped as a set of relationships between the social, the biological, and the technological. So it's a complex study which is actually, I think, of interest not only to those who are critical of the entire construct of race, but is also in constant dialogue with those in the natural sciences, in the life sciences, who are not quite convinced that the idea should be thrown out of the window. She has two other very interesting projects, and I'll mention them in a moment. She has a very, very interesting book, which for those of you who don't know it, you should take a look at, and that is her ethnographic study of scientific practice related to the Human Genome Diversity Project. So this is her monograph, which appeared with the Cambridge University Press, and I can recommend it very, very highly. She's working on two projects, one with a very intriguing title, Dutchness in Genes and Genealogy, and I hope we'll get to discussing that in the discussion, but it's about how Dutchness, being Dutch, is enacted in collaborations between archaeologists, genealogists, and population geneticists. And she's the founding chair of the European Network for the Social Studies of Forensics and is convener of a series of seminars on the relevance, irrelevance of race in science and society. She won last year and was awarded the Emma Goldman Prize this year, an award which was instituted by the Flex Foundation, and that is where I come to my very sincere words of gratitude for Mieke Verloo, who not only I think is one of the founders, founding members of the foundation with a set of colleagues, but she also had this wonderful idea to bring the award and the award ceremony and the 6 winners to the IWM. So the Flex Foundation owes Mieke is the initiator of this entire award, which is given for looking at questions of gender, questions of race, questions of inequality in a larger holistic perspective. And we hosted the ceremony at which the awards were presented and hope to do that in next year as well. And this links us to the present colloquium for today. But the interesting thing about the award is that it's not restricted to people who are just working in the ivory tower on issues of inequality, gender, differences, diversity, but also interested equally in public outreach and in public-spirited engagement in the field. And with that, I want to mention a singular achievement of Amade's, which I hope we'll get to talk about with you in the discussion, and that is she's chair of the Stitching Drowned Migrant Cemetery. It is a foundation which is committed to setting up a dignified cemetery for migrants who have drowned in Zarzis in her native Tunisia. And with that, I give you the word and a warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shalini, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Mieke, for acting as my discussant today. I'm incredibly grateful to have won the Emma Goldman Prize. Just for connecting my name to Emma Goldman is already a big honor. And thank you also here. I hope the sound is okay. Thank you for being here. I think Shalini was promising you something that I will not deliver today, which is that I would be talking about race and forensic much. I won't actually. It is indeed the project that I have been working on with a large team for a while, and it is also a very important part of my work, but it led me to a corner. And that corner became a site of research that was actually small. It was intended to be small, and it grew bigger and bigger. I think it will be the direction that I will be moving into for the coming years to come, if that is allowed. So, yes, let me just read it out, and I hope it will be clear. So the paper I'm presenting today is a drawing together of some of the ingredients for a book that I'm currently sketching, and I will contain my own work, but also the work of a friend, an artist from the south of Tunisia, Mohsen the, and I will introduce him to you shortly. The book is obviously still a puzzle. It will contain pictures of Mohsen's art, his poetry, as well as short essays, photos, and stories that are based on my own research. In this book, we want to attend to migrant death, but we want to take the place, which is the beach and the shores, where bodies are found seriously, and take account of that place and what that gathers together. So the book is part and parcel of this wonderful Emma Goldman Award. The book is about death and dying in the Med, and it addresses the question of how did these bodies end up here? A forensic question par excellence. But a question that we will not answer in any linear way. We want to attend to bodies in a more generous way, I would say, by juxtaposing different material traces and weaving multiple stories together. Stories that we are in the habit of keeping apart. Stories about ecological disasters, overfishery, colonial extractions, violence, brain drain, borders, migration, and death. And the book wants to make 3 interventions. So first, precisely by attending to death and dying, and situating this not just in Europe's border management regime, but in a much wider context, we make a political intervention. We want to demonstrate that what we are facing is not so much a humanitarian crisis, but a political crisis that implicates us in profound ways. Second, working with a broad collection of traces, we want to make a theoretical contribution by showing that what we came to know as Europe's migration crisis is not so much a crisis, but a chronic situation, a manifestation of Europe's ongoing post-colonial involvement on the African continent, the reasons why millions of people are adrift and will be adrift for years to come. And three, methodologically, we also suggest a shift from forensics aimed at providing evidence about a single fact, a single event, or the identification of one individual to also entail forensics as an art of paying attention to a broader picture. A move towards materiality and material traces that could help us to articulate the ambivalences and politics of persistent colonial relations. So this is to give you a bit of a context for the snippets of stories that I will now turn to. As I started to follow the traces of bodies that in recent years went missing in the Mediterranean, I found myself moving away from Europe, from its soil, its politics, and ways of knowing the dead. This movement was neither firm nor fast. It was more like a meandering of a creek, hesitant, and full of ambivalences. For was not this crisis already so hyped, and refugee camps already so crowded by researchers? Yet I kept moving, wondering, who are these people that did not make it to Europe alive? I started to ask this question also because of, hold on. Yes. Because I am involved in this project, the ERC project, that looks at various forensic technologies that are aimed at giving a face to an unknown person, a suspect, or a victim of crime. And this is what Shalini was mentioning earlier, this ERC project. So here we look at three technologies of giving a face. There's DNA, so going from DNA traces that are found at the crime scene and the DNA that you can extract from that, and trying to say something about the appearance of the unknown person. And the second technology that we look at is craniofacial reconstruction, so the reconstruction based on the skull. And the third is the most classical, one could say, technology of producing a picture or a composite based on eyewitness account. And you can do this, of course, by drawing, but also by computerized technologies. The idea is to follow from the laboratory, research and development laboratory, to the courtroom, the relation between the individual and the collective that is already there, because you don't know. You start with a large collective and slowly but surely try to work yourself towards an individual, and to see how this relation changes when this relation becomes racialized. This is a way of learning about how race is made relevant in specific practices. So we study, as I say, these technologies in order to learn something about how race becomes relevant in knowing the individual, and also what race is made to be in forensic research. We have this tendency to think of race as the biological. Well, it has never been solely the biological, never in the history of our, piles and piles of books that we have produced since the 18th century. Well, and precisely because the combination of biology, crime, and race is pretty intense and has a long history, and because it might lead us to see race everywhere, and this is something that I was quite nervous about, of reifying race ourselves as researchers, specifically in continental Europe, where race is not a common word, so to speak. And we have all sorts of nice words, culture, religion, and language, and so on, to do diversity. But because we don't use race in our language, I was pretty anxious about doing this research. So because of that, I was thinking of a contrasting project, a case outside of the criminal justice system where these technologies do something nice in medical practice, but also in the stuff that I will be talking about today. Now, reading about the migration, reading about dead migrants as they were filling our newspapers almost on a daily basis in 2015 and 16 and after, I was soon to find out that although there was effort made by NGOs to count the dead, there was hardly any political interest in identifying them, in giving them a name or a face. And this situation is now slowly changing. We can discuss that later, I don't go into that here. And while figuring out the little bit of identification that was happening, I found myself in the south of Tunisia, in the town of Zarzis, which is actually my hometown. It was fishermen that led me there. I learned about their work as first responders, rescuing people at sea, but also taking care of dead bodies or helping the Coast Guard by estimating for them where and when they could expect a body that the wind will take to a specific place on the shores of Zarzis. Their work inspired me to think about forensic infrastructure as emerging rather than fixed and rigid as we know it in the criminal justice system, and to think about how the knowledge of fishermen becomes temporarily part of that forensic process, such as indicating how fast bodies would move about. But it also helped me to broaden the notion of forensics in more radical ways, from an objectified practice that is aimed at producing scientific evidence, bringing evidence to the forum as Eyal Weizman has it, to forensics as an art of paying attention, as a possible mode of tracing, of facing and accounting for the refugee crisis. Exploring forensic as an art of paying attention, I am inspired by the Belgian philosopher and chemist Isabelle Stengère. Paying attention is precisely an art, she says, because it is a matter of learning, a matter of cultivating and tasting as to distinguish and differentiate. Paying attention creates obligations, and it does so, for example, for fishermen. You cannot look away, you have to turn around and help, says Shalini Mcharek, who's actually a cousin, as I found out. So making ourselves pay attention creates an obligation to imagine, to check, and to trace. Paying attention is therefore a way of establishing connections between things that we are in the habit of keeping separate. Connections between here and there, between us and them, between now and then. But it was not just the fishermen who brought me to the south of Tunisia. Also litter, waste, did. The material traces of the so-called refugee crisis. And obviously I was not the only one who was drawn by the heaps of orange life vests, backpacks, golden foil blankets, wood wreckage and what have you. Traces of the dramas at Europe's border. And as I arrived in Zarzis on my first field trip, I mean, I know the place very well, but this was my first official, professional field trip, in June 2016, I was to find out that litter played a pivotal role in the care for the dead bodies that wash ashore. In one of the conversations I had with Dr. Mongislim, who is the head of the Red Crescent in the south of Tunisia and who's responsible for the management of dead bodies, he said, the cemetery of migrants in Zarzis is a problem. The city owns that slot of land, but it's actually a landfill. So that means you cannot dig a proper grave. So the bodies that have been washing ashore since the late 90s have not been left there on the beaches. They were obviously not litter. They were buried. But as I visited the burial site several times, I came to realize that the difference between litter and human remains is not that stable. And this is to give you, this is how the cemeteries sometimes look like. This is the old provisional cemetery and not the one that you mentioned, Shalini, that we are currently working on. And it's getting there and it's going to be beautiful. Yes, so sometimes it looks like this. In June 2017, I was there when a young boy, 6 or 7 years old, was buried. After the cursory medical examination and after having waited for hours for permission from the prosecutor to bury, it was already in the middle of the night. We then drove outside the city, behind the police and an excavator. In fact, one that is used during the day to clean up the dirt in the city. Yusuf, the driver of the excavator, dug the grave, and provided us with light as to bury the boy. But when I returned to Zarzis in November that year, and this was after a period of heavy rain, I visited the cemetery again, but I was baffled that I could not recognize any structure in it. Graves were washed away, and litter had come to the surface, as you can see here. And as I walked around, Shamsuddin, who buries many of these bodies, asked me to walk behind him, as not to step on the graves. He knows the site by heart. At a certain moment, I paused and I was staring at some bones, expecting them to have belonged to an animal. I moved about, and finally I dared to ask, and I said, "Is that him, the young boy?" "Sure," said Shamsuddin. "Those are probably his ribs." Now, this was obviously a painful moment. Human remains as litter. But what if we were to take litter as human remains seriously? Litter as human remains. What if we would attend to litter forensically? Forensics in the sense that I propose here, as an art of paying attention. And it is at this point that I would like to introduce you to my friend Mohsen. And I would like you to first meet him via a documentary that was dedicated to him and to his work by Al Jazeera. It was called The Garbage Artist of Zarzis, and it was broadcast in 2017, November 2017. Let's see if the technology won't fail us. The first 3 minutes. No. You have to start earlier. No. YouTube, yes. No. Can you go back to the beginning, please? To the beginning. Yes, very beginning. Yeah, it's good.
أنا محسن ليزر مفكر حر لكن في نفس الوقت من عام 1993 وليت أي فرصة أول فرصة نخرج للبحر والخروج هذا للبحر يسمى محيط طبيعي خاطر كبرت في البحر لذلك معناها بديت أجمع كل ما ألتقيه معناها أراه في البداية مش بالضرورة أنه هو هدف بيئي. Pour le particulier, c'était avec la première chose c'était avec les bouteilles à la mer. J'ai trouvé des bouteilles avec des messins, et puis après j'ai trouvé des chaussures des harara. Ce sont au moins 4000 personnes qui sont mortes dans la mer Méditerranée à partir de la Libye. Voilà le fait de faire bouger les chaussures et ma façon de faire revivre un peu leurs propriétaires qui sont morts dans la mer. Bien sûr, un peu tous ces objets, ces chaussures que j'ai récoltées, que j'ai chéries, que j'ai respectées à travers elles, c'est-à-dire les gens qui sont morts, elle a été ramassée sur une distance de 150 km, c'est-à-dire le littoral du sud-est de la Tunisie. C'est un sujet très triste et émouvant, mais bien sûr, je ne le prends pas.
Der Tennisarm oder Golfer.
Well, let's leave it there. It's okay. Yes, I'll continue with the presentation. Thank you. So during my field trips, I kept hearing about this Mohsen, mostly in pejorative wordings, as someone who is somewhat odd, if not weird. But when I finally found out where he lived and visited him in June 2017, we talked for 3 hours in a row, to return the next morning at 5 and go for a long walk, where I would learn about his work of collecting stuff and about the landscape that he engages. And since then, we kept talking and walking along the coast of Zarzis, and Mohsen would teach me about the ancient and contemporary history of the people and the place. And what you see here is are pictures of our most recent walk 4 weeks ago. I will come back to this at the very end of my talk, but here I would like to point out what you see, the boat there in the left is actually one of the boats that has been used by migrants and that was drifted to the shore. And you can see that it has, there's impact at the foresight. Probably they were stopped by coast guards that took people off the boat. And also you don't find any traces of the people. So they left orderly, so to speak, after this impact rammed against the boat. Yeah. So you did not have a chance to hear more about Mohsen, but Mohsen is a retired postman. He jokes about himself saying that he used to collect and distribute letters, and now he collects and distributes litter. But in fact, he ended up being a manager of one of the main post offices in Zarzis. He's a respected amateur archaeologist, has taught himself the English and German language because he loves books, and since decades he's member of the board of the city library. He's a blogger and a poet. And precisely because he speaks his mind on a wide range of societal issues, and because he did so already under the Ben Ali regime, he became enemy number 1 for the local authorities. Did you ever go to jail? I asked him. I wish I had, he answered. That might have been much easier. I was stalked by the authorities, provoked on a weekly basis, at least 3 times a week. They would come after me. I kept record of the numbers of files that I got while driving. 65 fines, pure provocation. Enemy number 1, I asked. Well, you know, in 1996, I made lots of noise, especially because of the graveyard of the haraga. And a haraga is an Arabic word for those who burn. It's a complicated word that I've just written something about, but let's say that it means undocumented migrants, haraga. So people were buried, he says, but no one was allowed to know where. And I made a point that they were dumped on a waste yard. The city council did not like that, and although I have a responsibility towards my family, I never stopped denouncing and protesting. It is my obligation to take notice. It is my obligation to speak. When he was about 40 years old, as you just heard, Mohsen had started to walk the beaches and to collect traces of movements. He collected anything that washes ashore and would at a certain point use it for artistic configurations. Initially, his work focused on what he calls an ecological action movement, so protesting the ecological problems. But confronted with dead bodies, already in the 90s, he had started to collect the traces of migrants that did not make it to Europe alive. I'm going to show you just a couple at random things that he did. He works a lot with shoes in this kind of circles. This is one of the most recent. It's not a good picture, but it's actually quite good. And this one I like best with the chicken. For more than a decade, Mohsen had been collected endless numbers of shoes and slippers, clothes and accessories, and used these in his artistic work. These configurations, as he calls them, are to be found in his yard and in the small museum that he had initiated, but also in the landscape around Zarzis. And they are always open for others to change them as they feel. He actively invites visitors to touch and engage with the material. Yet walking around in his yard and museum is overwhelming because he had collected so much stuff. I asked him one day, do you have any hierarchy, things that are more important to you than others? And he looked at me and his answer came promptly. These are all sea bottles. messages in bottles. They carry messages and lives in them. I need to take them very seriously, all of them, not all the time, but sometimes. To be sure, Mohsen is not simply interested in the intrinsic qualities of these objects. He takes them out of their context, juxtaposes them, displays them in such a way as to unfold where they came from, or to provoke radically different stories and other engagements. So here, one placed in the landscape, but I wanted to share this one with you. This, for example, is a DNA double helix in the middle of the landscape in a Subra, to indicating there's life here, even if it looks very deadly to you. His configurations would occasionally draw attention to the objects. In other cases, it is the landscape that moves into view, a landscape that people would otherwise pass without noticing. This Subra landscape is also one that is threatened by environmental problems that have to do with a company that is nearby. I will say something briefly about it. So these are sometimes amazing landscapes, such as the Subra, a typically coastal landscape. Here, the Subra is a saline flat, so where you can mine for salt. And I cannot but give you a parenthesis about colonial extraction about that. So imagine, I've shown you the slide with the graveyard. Next to the graveyard, there's a big hill, which is obviously a hill made of litter and waste that has been dumped there. If you climb up the hill, you see this. This is salt that is there collected by the French company Cotizal. Cotizal has been there during colonial era. So since the 20th century, they have been mining for salt, extracting it. And even today, and even after the revolution, they still buy the salt for 5 Tunisian cents for 1 ton, so 1,000 kilograms. The salt is put on these trucks. Every single day you see them pass by to the port of Zarzis and transported to Europe very easily. And not far from there, many small boats depart with people on them that try to reach Europe, which have much more difficulties to arrive, so to speak. And this is interesting to see how colonial legacies are still, are actually no legacies, but current practice. So back to Mohsen, one huge artwork that Mohsen has made in the 90s consists of multiple configurations in his yard and are made through plastic bottles that are filled with water. And you see them here on the roof. The whole place was filled with these bottles. I filled maybe 100,000 bottles. I filled them to answer to the thirst and greed for water of my ancestors, a response to the lack of water that they experienced and had to face. And so this is his yard, their yard. I mean, he has a family with amazing configurations. I mean, I was not there. This was before my time in the early 90s, but I've seen pictures. So he filled these bottles with water, but he was surprised by what the bottles did. While representing the need, this is what I mean by what they did. Well, these bottles represented the need for and the pivotal role of water of his ancestors, of our ancestors. The bottles did something surprising as well. They collected and gave back sunlight. So every morning, the yard that was filled with these bottles became an orchestra of sunlight. Bottles that come to be a common part of Mohsen's repertoire, and you see them all over. In the landscapes such as here, and while protesting the environmental problems that plastics and other litter causes, the bottles become the very device actually to appreciate the environment. Perhaps then one can read instances of waste allegorically as an art of meaning something other and more than what is being said. Now, since he has been collecting so many sea bottles, and not just plastic ones, but huge number of glass bottles, Mohsen had decided to quantify them. He found out that the bottles that wash ashore in Zarzis, this was in the early 2000s, display a variety of 700 to 800 different bottles. And studying the labels and caps of these bottles, he concluded that 85% of them must have come from Italy and the rest mostly from Greece. Now, his expertise on sea bottle is often called upon by designers, filmers, sorcerers, and here you see him at one of these conferences on bottles. And when he told me about his typical dynamic and engaged way, about this in a typical dynamic and engaged way, I said to him, you know, you talk about being angry, about moving fast and hard, but everything you do is actually slow. Slow movements and meticulous labor. So Mohsen looked at me then in silence with a faint smile on his face. I want to end here, but not quite. I would like to end with a short film, 2 minutes or so, about the most recent walk that we made along the shore. To be sure, we found lots of stuff there, clothes, and I mean, apart from the first boat that you saw, lots of clothing and bottles or what have you. And, but also this boat. And this boat I found dramatic, particularly dramatic, because the crime is so visible of what has happened to these people. And a couple of days before we went there, we were actually burying a number of people, 7 people in the new cemetery. It might have been, they could have been on this boat. So here you see that it is not the Coast Guard that have taken the people out of the boat because their stuff is still there. Lots of it, actually. I'm not a professional filmer, so this was just in the moment. I had to do something, so it's... So here you see it. There was apparently a hole in the boat. It was quickly repaired just by putting a bit of wood against it. And imagine people get on the boat mostly at night. They don't know where they get into. And from the outside, it all looks very fine. You will see it. Nicely covered up here. Very smooth. But no chance. I think we can leave it there. Thank you. Thank you.
No, I have one. Thank you very much, Amade. I think it's. I think through your presentation, you just do not just talk about the art of paying attention, because you're also doing it, right? You're also showing what it means to pay attention. And I think in your presentation, and I've also been reading some of the work that fits with this, like the article that you did with Sara Casartelli on forensic identification of dead migrants in Italy. I think it becomes clearer and clearer what your project is about. And for me, it somehow a concept that I've always been fascinated by, and this is the concept of subalternity. No, I'm in gender and politics, and you want to understand, if you're in gender and politics, why it is that in politics some people do not seem to matter. Some people do not seem to have a voice. And if you look at the scholarship on gender and politics, then subalternity, and then it's somehow a bit perverted counterpart of empowerment, is a crucial concept of trying to understand why it is that certain people do not seem to be a person in politics. Certain people do not seem to be a political subject. And because they are not a political subject, they cannot have a voice. You can only have a voice if you are a political subject, if you're recognized as belonging to a particular political community. And in all this work on subalternity, is of course about real people somewhere that are alive somewhere, alive human beings somewhere. So in that sense, it would seem that once you lose your life, you lose any possibility for being a political subject. But in the case of these drowned migrants, and I think there must be other categories of people that are in that category, it seems that also retrospectively, they seem to have lost their subjectivity altogether. Not only are they not a political subject, now they're dead, but also they're denied any political subjectivity ever in their life. They're erased somehow from the world in that sense. So I think when I read, for instance, I think in the article with Sara Casartelli, you elaborate on that and say if you start this work of identifying these dead migrants, these bodies become people. They become individuals that belong to a community, rather than objects or waste or litter to be disposed of. And in that sense, it is a chance to become a political subject, even when their life has been taken from them through all the political dynamics around them. And so it's through this material forensic work, but also maybe through this artistic work that Mohsen is doing, that these drowned people become part again of a collective of human beings. So I am wondering if what you're working on is also about this, about not just, and in that sense is a very positive type of work that you're doing, no? It is, of course, it's atrocity, right? What happens, and to be confronted with these atrocities. But what you're doing is you restore something, in a way. You make these people again part of a collective of human beings, and in that sense also you point at a way of maybe we shouldn't just be concerned about who gets a voice, which is like what, and who gets agency, which is what the subalternity literature would make us focus on, but maybe we should also think more about the art of listening, the art of paying attention, because without anyone who's listening or anyone who's paying attention, there can be no voice. There can be no agency in a political sense. So I want to thank you, because I got this like insight from listening to you and reading this work, that maybe this focus on the active part of people should just speak and who can speak and who cannot speak, but also people should listen and people should pay attention. And why I think this is so important is, I think, because it shifts away from the duties and obligations of the people who have no voice through the people who do have a voice and who are in the position that they could listen, that they could pay attention. And I think for that, I think theoretically there is a wealth of things still to be explored in this. So that's, I think, what I like a lot about your work. So.
So thanks so much, Mieke, for these comments. Amade, so this for a very, very powerful presentation. Thank you very much. We can open the floor right here to questions. If I don't see anyone right away, maybe I could begin with one to just start the discussion going. And then I'll pick up questions from the chat as well, so I can read with Sarah, whoever has posed a question to you who's not in the room. What I was thinking about listening to you was, in a sense, a double erasure, if you like, because these are people who may have had good reason not to want to be identified. So they themselves have tried to obliterate the traces of their identity. They may have documents which are forged. They may have no documents at all. They may have thrown away. I mean, in your case, of course, none of them are alive to be able to tell you that tale. But the erasure which is happening afterwards is already on top of an erasure of their identity, which they have very good reason not to want to be recognized. And then, of course, you don't quite know, or maybe the question to you is, yes, you do want to trace them, give them a face, a biography. You want that they be buried also because their family is to be notified, is interested in the burial. And not only, however, that, but for the family, this is also a question of maybe not wanting to reveal that a family member is missing or has crossed or tried to cross in this particular fashion through. And then you have all the people who are involved in these crossings, who are making a living out of helping migrants cross. They have an equal interest in erasing all the work that they are doing. So in a sense, there are multiple layers of erasures here on, and then you're trying to reconstruct the traces not only of a person but a journey, the belonging to a community, on top of the other erasures which are happening. So I was hearing you, I was just struck by the fact of just how much has to be excavated. And if it, and this was my, so this was sort of my ethical question, political question was, if it should be excavated, and how much there is to be excavated. So that's, so just sharing with you some thoughts listening to this very, very powerful and moving presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Shalini. Thank you. Also, Mieke, for your comments. No, I shouldn't do them together. I think there are so many layers to this question, and also so many practices that speak to it. So yes, there are people that, of course, do not travel with their own identity papers for very good reasons. Or there are people that hide them or burn them. There are people that burn their fingers or what have you to not be identified here in Europe, because that's what we do. We register people that way. And should we then be undoing that or identifying people? I think that's a difficult question to answer in general. What I started out saying is that I find it remarkable that Europe is really not interested in helping out, in doing this identification work. We do this, you know, the moment an airplane crashes or whatever happens for European citizens. Millions and even milliards of people of money is invested in order to identify the tiny little bones that we find, and for good reasons. And so that's a sharp contrast with what is happening in the Mediterranean. And also, despite, I mean, we are getting organized in Europe. So the southern European countries, Greece, Spain, Italy, Malta, and even without, from the Netherlands, the ICMP, which is an organization that was grounded in Srebrenica to identify the 8,000 men that were massacred. So they are willing to organize, but there is no money, there's no funding, there is no political interest in doing this. So that is already something that we need to account with this work. Identification is immensely difficult in this case. First of all, most bodies have disappeared. They went to the bottom of the sea, so they're not there. You can't find them. There's only a tiny fraction that would be found either in Europe or Northern Africa. Once you find the bodies, you can't do your conventional forensic technologies. It's really novel kind of work that needs to be developed in doing that. Now, the International Committee for the Red Cross, the ICRC, is now beginning to collect DNA to compare to bodies that are found here in certain places in Africa. People are hesitant to do so. You don't know whether the DNA will end up. Maybe your relative is alive and they're just after that person. You don't know. There's no reason to trust European organizations, and so it is hard. And there are different levels of complexities. Now, I must say that where we stand now with the forensic work, and I was recounting about fingerprints. You know, you can't do fingerprints because the epidermis gets loose in the sea, but there are novel technologies being developed to get underneath, not on the epidermis, but underneath it, and that might be a way of identifying people. So we're looking for new technologies, and at the same time, I think this work that although this is what we are doing in Zarzis, we are developing a kind of forensic mode of working in order for, if relatives in the future are interested in figuring out what happened to they could have a possibility to go there. But most work is really, it's a political project. It is a political project to make us here in Europe understand that this is not really about individuals. This is a huge political problem that we are having, we have inherited for centuries, and that we are reproducing. It is about that, I think, mostly for me at least. Yeah.
Thank you a lot for your very important presentation. And I wanted actually to ask you if you could speak more or to elaborate on your point about framing this situation as the crisis versus chronic situation. And I wanted to ask about the political dimension of this framing as a crisis, because it occurred to me that these practices of dehumanization, of basically burying people in the landslides, how they fit into this framing of the crisis, or how they become possible due to the framing of the crisis. And at the same time, like, it struck me that actually that this artistic work, how it provides a very alternative way of recovering this situation from framing it as a crisis, as something exceptional, because there is both exceptional and something that you want also to overcome and to forget as something that can be left behind. And how this artistic work somehow recovers these traces and resists to this framing. But if you could speak more about this crisis versus chronic situation framing. Thank you.
I think it is very problematic to speak of a crisis when it comes to migration, and there is no reason to do so. Of course, there are certain peaks, as we have seen with the war in Syria or the effects of the Arab revolutions. But I mean, the moment you attend to what is happening, you see that this is something of a longue durée. That's something that has been happening, ongoing. I mean, in Africa, I mean, millions and millions of people are adrift. The crisis here comes also, it's often a humanitarian crisis, right? It's also to make it a situation that is surprising to us, and now we have to act upon this situation as if there was no weapons, brought to this country, there was no war that was somehow helped to enroll and what have you. So it is, I'd like to move away from this thinking of crisis to make space, to think about the situation differently, to look into relations that have been cut and relations that have been established, as I said, about the kind of ongoing extractions that are going on, the kind of environmental problems that are produced by companies such as Shell, making life impossible, polluting water for people, going with Dutch companies, going to Tunisia, growing the best tomatoes ever, taking the water away from farmers, local farmers, so they can't farm anymore. So of course you take the boat, that's better, this is the way of making a living for your family. So I mean, it is actually, the moment you dig into it, it is so clear, sometimes very causal, the relations, often not that causal, obviously, but I hope this is a bit helping you.
Yeah, it's a question for clarification, actually, because if in saying it's not a crisis, it's a chronic situation, I would think that the way you now explain it, you would say it's not a crisis, it's actually an ongoing system. It's an ongoing system of extraction and exploitation, and that produces this migration. So where situation is, but this is because I'm into social complexity theory, so if I think something is a system, then I think, okay, I know how to conceptualize it, then because a system is something that is ongoing and it has a tendency to reproduce itself all the time in different forms, and a crisis is something that disrupts a system, right? So what you're saying is this is not a disruption of anything, right?
For Europe, maybe temporarily, but definitely not for the people at stake.
Thank you so much. It was very powerful. I would be happy to go back to your third introductory point on forensic as a way to pay attention, because actually you talked a lot about art. So I'm interested to know, so who is listening, who is paying attention to you as a researcher and a scholar, and who is paying attention to Mohsen as an artist, and how you have collaborated, and how this collaboration can also help you to have more people paying attention. So how concretely, so who is listening to Mohsen? Because apparently the conference you mentioned was him as an expert on bottles, was not him as an artist, which is quite different. So he was still somehow an expert for shell-like people, let's say like that. So who is paying attention? What his strategy to be listening to have his voice heard, and beyond his voice, having the destiny of these migrants heard too, and how do you frame your own collaboration beyond writing a book? So how does it render each of you more powerful somehow?
So I think Mohsen, as I said in the beginning, and also maybe it is changing a little bit in Zarzis as well, because many things have happened in the last decade. So first, from being this weird guy and interesting, you know, these bottles. Because everybody, my mother, that's Mohsen, I know the bottles, you know. But other than that, she didn't know. I think he has become, there's many school kids that would come to the museum and would come to the yard to look at his work, and he would introduce sometimes in ecology, the other times in migration issues or in archaeology. I mean, he's mind-blowing what he knows there, and he has all sorts of stuff around that he can talk about. So locally, more and more people are becoming interested, and also in our collaboration, I must say, I also try to help out, you know, think of strategies or pay for the bus for children to come and these kind of things. Internationally, because Zarzis became somehow known, the Zarzis fishermen. A couple of years ago, the head of the Zarzis Fishermen and Ecological Organization was imprisoned in Italy because he was accused of smuggling and of helping helping migrants to get to Italy. So this became also a moment of visibility. Again, they have been protesting against neo-Nazis that were in the sea a couple of years ago. So they became visible, and Mohsen is also in close collaboration with the fishermen because he's interested in ecological questions, and our local fishermen are also interested in that because they're seeing the devastating situation that is happening in the Med in that area. So this is a way. Another way, I mean, as I work on race and forensics and talk to my forensic friends and you know, advise the Ministry of Justice on issues that deal with hardcore forensics, I'm also working on this issue. So I also try to intervene in the policy area, like what can we do, how can we mobilize? Now with the cemetery in Tunisia, I try to make this also an international thing, like trying to have international companies to help with the equipment. You know, it's very expensive to have a morgue and to have a place where you can do this kind of studying the bodies and rescuing the samples and all these things. So that is one aspect of that work, and together with Mohsen, I think it's a journey how we work together. So the conversation have started. We became friends almost instantly because we really there's a click, and now with the book, I'm contemplating when to bring. He's not here for reasons, but I'm contemplating how to bring him to the Netherlands and to see how we can do something together there. But what the future will bring is really open. How we can develop that. I don't have a set framework for that. But it's on different, this is what I want to say. We do different kinds of things. He does different kinds of things and I do different kinds of things. And yeah, there's no one single way of going about it.
Before I pass on the word, may I just read a question from someone who's sent us one? So this question says, could you elaborate on the broader theoretical or methodological implications of the concept of paying attention and its potential for the practice of anthropology or even for social science at large?
Yeah. Yes, thank you for this question. I think this is important. This is also to let you know that while we tend to think of ourselves as social scientists, as you know, we're very critical, we're very smart vis-a-vis the natural sciences. You know, they don't know what they're doing, and they don't understand. You know, of course they're good at what they do, but they don't see the implications. And I like actually, you know, having been also in the lab myself and all these things, to take these fields seriously. And it is actually, this is what I learned from forensics. I mean, forensics is really a meticulous kind of work. It is tedious kind of work. It is work about materiality. You have to do with the sporen, the traces that you find there. You have to think of ways. You have to think back and forward. What has happened in the past, and how can I figure something about it for the future in a courtroom? So that you have to. So you work with materiality and you work with temporalities and you work with different kinds of scenarios. It seems like a very linear practice, and it is, of course, and it has to be orderly and it is protocoled and standardized. At the same time, in that work, you have to do lots of tinkering with material. So it is the material is what you go by, and I like this. So what it gives me is to stay true and close to the materialities and to listen to that, as it were, as Mieke said, and at the same time to think of materials as complex things. It doesn't have a unified identity, a singular identity. But precisely because it can be connected to so many things, a bottle that is a bottle of water that represents a particular anxiety about not having water, that all of a sudden gives light, and tremendous light, beautiful light. You know, it is these things depending on what the relation is, right? Its relation to the body, it feeds you, it's important. Its relation to the sun, it becomes something else. So this kind of complexities of matter, I think, is important in this work, and the temporality aspects, because I think we have to think of Europe as a colonial power, to put it very bluntly. I mean, it is horrendous what is happening in the so-called global south. And these are not instances, these are not incidents, this is a structural matter. And if we want to think about the globe and our future together, then we have to take that seriously. That history that is also a present.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm really touched and impressed, and I do realize that there is very intense dialogue going on between anthropology and art. But I would like to ask you two questions, and they are also related to certain doubts and certain dangers that may appear here. And the first question would be about what would you say? I mean, this is something that makes me a bit anxious, and I'm not sure. But if somebody is experienced in the field of contemporary art, he may discover that there is certain tradition or certain continuity in paying attention into the materiality of the illegal migrants or refugees. And they are, you know, works like brincachures that were designed in order to help Mexico migrants to cross the border to the US. So they were especially produced in China, and they were equipped with a map, with a torch, with a compass, and it was something that later on entered Galleria, like Tate Modern, and started to work as an object of art. So it was somehow extracted from the real life, from the real suffering, from the real political context. I remember well the work that was presented recently. It was a kind of miniaturized construction of wired fences that were placed in the, you know, the Spanish enclaves in Morocco, and also it was also something that was created in order to convey certain meaning. But I still wonder. This is not the first moment when first time when I posed this question myself. What has happened when this way of paying attention, which is related to kind of artistic installation, because even when we cite this work in this original work that was produced by a friend, that it somehow enter the gallery world, and the interplay between these certain traditions, you may also, even taking into account this work that was, you know, produced by very famous Richard Long, who built a kind of circle from the wooden pieces brought to the beach by the waves from the sea. And later on it was criticized by Rashid Arin, a Pakistani and a British artist also, who did the same Arctic circle. It was in the north of the US, in the Alaska. It was made with the empty bottles. Trying to pay attention to the problem with, you know, unemployment, alcoholism, etc., and the real situation of the indigenous people over there. So the problem is not the wooden pieces, but so the first my question would be, aren't you afraid that we can put this work into this larger row or continuation or frame of artistic work, which is placing that in the place that we probably wouldn't like to see there, because this is really the sense of distraction of the real life, of the suffering. And the second question would be about ethnography and ethnographic methods. Do you believe that this object, this study on materiality, is enough, and should it be somehow supplemented or complemented by the stories, by the real stories. I mean, the stories which are related, for instance, to this, you know, desperate motivation and the kind of increasing of the motivation that I already read your article on Haraga, so I realize what does it mean to burn the borders. But I also remember very beautiful article published in Ethnos journal, which was about people trying to enter these Spanish enclaves and to cross these wired fences. So they were saying also that they are motivated. They are creating kind of meetings, and they feel that they can eat the fences. That was exactly what they say. I mean, that they are able to eat the fences. So they were using the idiom bank, and that, as I remember, rising this bank, this kind of vital force, was the crucial point there. So to put it in other words, I mean, this is also the story about certain journey that is undertaken, that it leads very often across Africa. I mean, that those people migrating to the coast of the Mediterranean, they also very often start their journey in Western Africa, in Central Africa. The first sea that they have to cross is actually the desert, the Sahara, and they call this also the sea.
Horrible, yeah.
And this rising bank is really important. So, to finish this quite long story and question, do you believe that we can use materiality without adding or complementing and bringing about a lot of the stories that are somehow hidden and attached to these pieces, to this you know remains that you found?
Yeah. Thank you, Thomas. Try to think about how to be a little bit brief in my answers. Of course, I think it matters where art is to be found, whether it is, you know, found outside in a landscape or in a museum or in Zarzis or here in Vienna. Or I've seen even a piece of art of Mohsen in a museum in Tunis. It didn't work at all. So, so of course, art can lose its quality or gain a novel quality the moment you transport it from a place to the other. And I think as much as I love art and artistic expressions, for the purpose of this work that we are doing, I really try to think with what Mohsen is doing rather than take it as it is, and to think and juxtapose it indeed with other stories, and to think what can it elicit, how can it help us understand what is going on, how can it help us convey a story, a different kind of story. I think what we want to do is really tell a different kind of story beyond migration studies, beyond refugee studies, beyond maybe, and this brings me to your other point, beyond a kind of human-centered approach, either of European policy, human-centeredness, on the humanitarian or the border protection, our vulnerable border, so to speak. But to decenter the human stories a little bit, not to forget about them at all. I mean, of course they're important, and of course we have to find also ways of writing them up as anthropologists. So of course we are in the business of writing, right? So it's, I think, figuring out how does the story fit the normative question that I want to address, the political intervention that I want to make. And the way to decenter human agency, because, you know, subjectivity, citizenship, you know, how can we think about relational citizenship? How can we think about, indeed, even dead people as, you know, provoking, talking to us in certain ways that we can understand what citizenship is about. So, and in that sense, I find it important to divert our focus from humans and their stories and representations of what has happened to materialities. in this particular problem that we are facing.
So also thank you, Amade, for making us pay attention. I think this is the most immediate result of your work and doesn't need any further explanations, and that's the goal you achieve immediately by doing this presentation. I would want to go back to what Shalini mentioned in her introduction in the beginning to your very interesting earlier research that was did not come so much into your presentation now. This also very interesting title of race face idea.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very nice wording. Mieke was also known for very nice wordings, but this is also one. So you have a certain tradition here for the race face idea, because it so nicely depicts the idea of identifying somebody individually, but also as the carrier of a, let's say, collectivity that is embodied in an individual. And this brings me to Shalini's earlier question. I mean, is it even needed to identify somebody individually? I mean, it could also be a very important goal of your research to identify, for example, where people come from. I mean, if you achieve that goal, it's not even needed to say this is the individuum XYZ, but it could be, I mean, people are coming from the north of Nigeria. Why do they come from the north of Nigeria, or whatever? I mean, so I just would want to know if this, I mean, if this would not be a very tangible and immediate result of your research, if without even if you were able to identify somebody individually, this might not even be needed, but it would be a much more important message to find out where people are coming from, and then maybe ask why they are coming from that special region. And maybe a second short question that relates to the forensic part that Alessandro already also asked about. When you spoke about it, you also 2 or 3 times you mentioned the word evidence, and I mean this is a classical juridical term. You collect evidence because you will have some investigation, a court case. Obviously, in these many cases of the people drowning, we don't have anything like that. Nevertheless, you're collecting evidence, and my question would be, I mean, obviously you're addressing this to the public audience of wherever, I mean, in all the states, and especially, I guess, for the Europeans. But once again, also the collecting evidence as such, once again, could be a very important message.
Absolutely.
Also, for example, in order to just tell us how many people drown, because I think we are not aware of it, and it is forgotten. I mean, there's estimates and there's initiatives that take care of that and that tell us about it, but I mean, all what we are doing is just, I mean, it's very, very foggy area, and I think in that sense also you have a very immediate result of this work.
Yeah. Thank you. Sometimes it is quite straightforward to find out where people came from if there are survivals. So then they would tell you, well, we were all from Mali or Niger or Nigeria. But if there are no survivors, it becomes really very difficult. And it is actually, that's where the problems start. So if you have no fingerprints, if there are no proper documentations, I mean, often the case, bodies are not really very, very human-like the way you find them. So, and by DNA it doesn't go, because we have a lack of DNA material from Africa, obviously. So we have quite large databases. We know a lot about European genetics, but we know quite little from Africa, and this is where the problems start. And if you want to identify a person, you have to compare to a population, but it has to be the proper population. If you compare, then you can say, well, fair chance that this person comes from that particular area in Africa. This is how it could start. But we are not there yet, so it is now really about collecting, and there's the ambivalence, you know, what to do with the surveillance on the one hand and doing something good on the other, so to speak. That is this is why I was enthusiastic about the the fingerprint, because that could be a way around this hugely expensive DNA problem. Now the fact is that more and more family members are actually looking for their relatives, and specifically a large group is the Syrian refugees. because many of them are in Europe, and many of them have lost family members along the way. It happened also to me that the Dutch police came over and said, well, we have this family and their daughter went missing. She was with her father. He lost her when the ship capsized, and he thinks he's dead, her mother thinks he's dead. It was in August 2014 near the Libyan-Tunisian border. They probably washed ashore. I think we even have pictures of this group of youngsters there. So can we do something? So this is a real question that is with us, that we will have to look into in Zarzis. So you see, this is then really about individuation rather than a collective statement. But we know that this boat, there were only Syrians on this boat that's left from Libya to Europe. Yeah, so it depends. It depends, and it's both equally complicated unless you have eyewitnesses or documents that can lead you and give you answers about where people came from. Now, the evidence bit is important. So the fact that bodies, if they are found, they have to be looked at by a medical professional is also to determine, is this a crime, or did somebody simply drown? So this is the moment where you have to make this decision. Now, in Italy, for example, they are capable of doing more research, for example, to find out if a person that arrived dead in a boat died because of dehydration or because of intoxication, because they're in the belly of the boat, and so there are different ways that people can die, and it's also important to actually collect this evidence, to know actually what crimes are happening, such as the boat that I showed you here. You know, what kind of crime is this? And I think this is important politically, not, of course, it's important to document this bureaucratically, but also politically to know how did these people die, and how are we implicated in this situation? I think it sounds a bit dramatic, but I really mean what I say. Yeah.
So actually, I think we've exhausted the set of questions here. I don't see anything here on the chat at the moment. And we've exhausted actually our time. But I think this is a discussion we will continue. You're going to be with us the whole month. So there is still time for further conversation with you on a topic which you've got us all paying attention to. Not only the deaths of migrants on European shores, but the kind of historical traces that we may want to think about, and in much larger structural terms, as Mieke pointed out, down to the individualization of biographies through particular regions, as Ludger was saying. So I think you've opened up a whole set of really, really interesting questions for us to pursue. Thank you very, very much for the presentation. And thank you once again, Mieke, and to the Flex Foundation. We owe you a deep debt of gratitude.
It's totally mutual.
Thank you.